Good afternoon, and welcome to the 10th and final Social Venture Partners Dallas Workshop for 2020. My name is Prisma Garcia, and I'm the Director of Capacity Building for Social Venture Partners Dallas. SVP is a group of engaged philanthropists that give back through their skill set and continue to build capacity of social impact organizations within North Texas. Today, we will have a very interesting and timely conversation about the Texas legislative session coming up in 2021. And we know 2021 will be a pivotal year. And as we learned last week in the Texas Legislature Responds, we learned that how bills become law, how money must be allocated, and what the budget will be. We're going to find out how we get to those decisions. And so it was only appropriate that we have a conversation on how do we get involved with the Texas legislature, in particular in this coming year after a global pandemic, which we're still facing now. So today I'm going to introduce quickly here our featured speakers, and we're going to let them and our moderator for today go into a deeper discussion and introductions. But we have Erica Beltran. She's the Chief Advocacy and Policy for the Leadership ISD. Kate Greer, she's the Director of Advocacy at the Commit Partnership. We have Stacy Mace, the Vice President of Strong Communities of United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. We have Colette Vallot, founder and managing partner of Entree Strategic Partners. And of course, we have Dan Waldman, an SVP partner, owner and principal of the Waldman Group. And he will continue this conversation as a moderator today. I would like to thank our sponsors for this workshop, Something Good Consulting Group, and of course, Wright Knatzer Law, for their continuous support of the workshops and Social Venture Partners Dallas. And if you're on social media, don't forget that you could use the hashtag SVPD Workshop, and you can tag or follow SVP Dallas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Waldman.
Thank you, Prisma, and good afternoon, everyone. The SVP Responds series, the session that was held last week, which had three amazing guests, Evan Smith from the Texas Tribune, Margaret Spellings from Texas 2036, and Gromer Jeffers from the Dallas Morning News. It's available to watch the taped version on the Social Venture Partners Dallas website, so I encourage you to check it out. We're going to try to focus today on really, as Prisma said, the how-tos, some tips from our four esteemed panelists. But if we have time, we'll also maybe talk about some of the issues that are likely to come before the legislature and get some insights and thoughts about some of the substantive policy decisions that we might see being debated in 2021. But let me give you a little bit more in-depth introduction of each of our guests today, and I want to thank them for making themselves available to join in this workshop. I'll start with Kate Greer. Kate is the Director of Advocacy for the Commit Partnership, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. It's really become one of the most influential education organizations in the state, and it was started right here in Dallas. Kate's a native of Flower Mound. She has experience as a legislative staffer in the Oklahoma House of Representatives and as a news reporter. She's been with Commit since 2018 and really played a critical role on the team that helped enact the school finance law during the 2019 session. We have Stephanie Mace joining us, the Vice President of Strong Communities from United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, one of our most valued partners at Social Venture Partners of Dallas. She's responsible for United Way's engagement in policy at the local, state, and federal level. And she is, in that role, she helps support advocacy by United Way's nonprofit partners. She's been with United Way since 2007. And before that, she was a budget and policy analyst in the Texas legislature. So I'm sure she'll have some valuable insight, especially with regard to the budget process. Erica Beltran is the Chief of Advocacy and Policy for Leadership ISD. a longtime education advocate in Texas. She actually started as a Teach for America Corps member, which many of our leaders in Dallas have experience with that fantastic program. She has been with Leadership ISD since 2015. Before that, she worked for a number of education-focused nonprofits and foundations. She also served as an elected member of the Texas State Board of Education from 2015 to 2019. And finally, Colette Belleau, who joins us. She is an attorney and government relations consultant for a variety of corporate, municipal, and nonprofit clients. Before launching her firm in 2016, which is based here in Dallas and also has an office in Houston. She spent 9 years as an external affairs and community relations executive at Energy Future Holdings and with which is also included TXU Energy. So thank you again to all of our panelists. We're going to do this with just hitting kind of a series of questions, discussion topics that I'll invite all of our panelists to add their input on. I encourage you to also, our audience members, to submit questions through the chat. Prisma will be monitoring that, and we'll try to get to as many questions from the audience as possible. So let's start with basically, how about a quick overview of how the Texas legislature works? And I'm thinking about things like how it's organized, how the calendar works, and just essentially how the process works. So to get us kicked off with that discussion, why don't I invite Colette to start with her input.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thanks for the introduction. And welcome, everyone. This is hopefully going to be a great discussion today. So I'd like to start out by talking about the Texas legislature in threes. Basically, there are two houses, a House of Representatives and a Senate, and then there's the governor. And then I'm going to divide it into three segments and really talk about January and February, then March, and then April and May, because the Texas legislative session, unlike Congress and unlike many of the other states in the US, we only have a legislative session every other year, and it's for 140 days, basically from January to the end of May. It begins on January 12th, and it ends generally on Memorial Day, which is called Sine Die, which is a great day in the Texas legislature because everyone's tired, and sometimes they're kind of tired of each other and all that sort of stuff. So after the legislature adjourns, then everybody is really happy and they go off to parties, and it's usually a gorgeous day in Austin. So, and then the third three is there are three readings generally for bills that go through the House and the Senate, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about that. So there really only one thing that needs to happen during the Texas legislature, and that is passing a balanced budget by the Constitution. And so I think one of our other panelists will talk about the budget process and what goes into the budget. There is one thing that you can't do, and when I was a sort of a young lobbyist, I didn't really understand going into the Texas legislature how they didn't do anything for the first couple of months. And so by the Constitution, no bill can be passed in the Texas legislature within the first 60 days, except for any emergency legislation that is presented by the governor. And generally that happens when the governor gives his State of the State address every biennium, every other year, and he lays out any emergency bills. So, but Texas legislature can't pass any bills unless there are those emergency bills within the first 60 days. And so let's talk about a little bit of the January, February, March, and then April and May. During January and February, it's really everybody's getting to know each other, everybody's getting friendly. The first day, January 12th, what's going to happen this session and what happens every year generally is all of the members are sworn in, and then on the House side, a Speaker of the House is elected. This year, the presumptive speaker is Dade Phelan, who is a state representative from the Beaumont area. And so he's garnered the support to become the speaker, but that won't happen officially until the first day of swearing in. On the Senate side, the same thing happens. The senators get sworn in. Dan Patrick is the lieutenant governor, so he is really the peer of the Speaker of the House. And so that's already done because that's an elected position. And then usually that afternoon, after everyone's sworn in and the rules are voted upon by the House, then everyone walks around the legislature and the Capitol and talks to people, and there's food brought in, et cetera. This year it will obviously be different because of COVID. And so there won't be as many people walking around the Capitol, et cetera. And we can get into those particular procedures a little bit later on during the discussion. And then in February, really, committees are decided for the House, and early in February, committees are decided for the Senate. And so the last Speaker of the House actually asked people what committees they wanted to serve on, and he generally gave those committees. So committee assignments are really important because that's where bills end up going. Any bill that is filed gets assigned to a committee, and if it gets out of committee, it then goes to the floor for a second and then a third reading. Remember, we talked about things in threes. So, and we can get a little bit deeper into that. So that really is generally what happens during, the end of February and March. And then in April and May is when the real work begins, when, people are trying to make sure that the bills get out of committees and get to the House floor or the Senate floor to be heard, and then it goes through the additional readings. There are a couple big things to remember. I call it kind of, death by 1,000 cuts. There are so many ways that a bill cannot get through. It's actually easier to kill a bill than it is to get a bill passed in most legislatures, because there are just lots of different ways to kill a bill, either on the floor, points of order. When it goes to the opposite chamber, they can kill the bill. It can come back. So if you have any specific questions, we can talk about that a little bit later. And pretty much in mid-April or the beginning of May become some really important deadlines. If your bill hasn't hit a certain milestone, then you're pretty much assured that perhaps the bill won't make it all the way through the process. Although there can be some ways that it can be revived, either through an amendment or something toward the end of the process. So that's really the process in a nutshell. There is a great site that I can refer you to, which one of the other panelists will talk about in a little more depth, but Texas Legislature Online and the Legislative Reference Library of Texas has a chart that you can really kind of follow how bills actually go through the process. So that's the basic process.
Thanks, Colette. I mean, I think that's really good. A lot of people aren't aware that this is a lot of the legislative process is actually set in stone, either in the Constitution or by some other statute. So things have to progress. It's much more orderly process than they might be used to if you're watching how things work in Congress. Before opening it up to the other panels, I did want to talk a little bit about the budget, since you said the only thing that they actually have to do is pass a budget. So Stephanie, I know that was something, you were a budget analyst, I think, at one point, but do you want to offer your thoughts, and maybe especially this year, and what's likely to be a session unlike any other we've had before, kind of the importance of the budget process for almost anything that's going through the legislature?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this amazing panel. The budget is very interesting. So going back to Colette's point, everything happens for the legislature is only in session. A regular session is for only 140 days. So a lot of the work, especially the agencies developing their budgets, is done in advance. It actually starts generally very close to the beginning of the year in an even numbered year, since the legislature meets in the odd number years. The governor and the Legislative Budget Board tells the state agencies how much money they have to spend. Usually it's based on kind of keeping it to how much they spent the previous year, or there's a reduction by 5 to 10, 20%, depending upon what the budget projections are going to look like. This year, we heard that from the governor and the Legislative Budget Board, which is it's a joint committee of both the House and the Senate that has staff that provides support, really looking support for the legislature on analyzing any type of budget or fiscal needs that they may have. The Legislative Budget Board generally sets and helps to draft kind of a budget at the very beginning. But this year, based on their analysis, the Legislative Budget Board and the Governor's Office asked for state agencies to reduce their budget by 5%. There were some agencies that were able to not limit their budget based on of their, in a lot of cases, it's kind of some of the priority agencies like TEA and some of the other agencies that were a lot of support during that period of time and with COVID. That kind of gives agencies the framework. And then from there, and around July and August, agencies are then submitting a budget, kind of their draft. It's called the Legislative Appropriations Request. Those are then submitted, and you can see all of those online. It gives an outline of how the agency wants to spend their money for the next 2 years, which is the biennium. You're also able to see if they have extra money, what they would use their exceptional items for, that exceptional money for. And then in August and to October, generally the House and the Senate both have hearings where they have an opportunity to hear from the state agencies' leadership on kind of a more thorough understanding of their budget for the next 2 years. And also they're able to get additional information about what they've been doing over the past year in relations to the budget. Of course, this year in the age of COVID, the House Appropriations and the Senate Finance were not able to have the number of meetings that they generally have. The Senate held a few in-person meetings, but a lot of it was done through public information requests. So we're interested to kind of see what it's going to look like this coming session. The Legislative Budget Board will also be setting the growth cap based on the Constitution limits the amount of growth for the budget over the previous biennium. And then in January, we should also be getting a better understanding of how much money that the legislature has to work with. That will be from the comptroller, usually around the first week of session. He will share his most up-to-date budget estimates. And then going out, then looking at the legislative process, the budget is developed very similar to other bills, where both the House and the Senate have a committee that is working on developing each of their own kind of a draft budget. They hold public hearings on each articles. There are multiple articles, which is kind of a focus on a particular issue. So there's an article focused on public safety, education, health. So then they hear kind of those agencies are kind of broken up by those topic areas. Usually around April or so, April, May, each of those committees will then send their completed draft to the chambers, to their respective chambers, where then they will vote on it. They have a very long process where in advance members are able to file amendments, where then the entire chamber is able to then vote up or down for amendments and changes to the budget. Once each chamber has finalized or voted on their budget and it's moving forward, then there's a conference committee that's created to then work out the details. Once that conference committee, made up of both senators, a handful of senators and representatives, they work out any of the differences, then the budget is then sent back to both of the chambers for their final approval. All of this must be done, like Colette said, before the end of session, and it's usually done, I would say like May, closer towards the end of session rather than the beginning of session.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. You did mention that there's actually a lot of this information is publicly available, like the agency requests. Where can people find especially if they're interested in a specific agency?
So I would go to the specific agency's website that you're interested in. So like TEA has their LAR on their website. Another great place to go to would be the Legislative Budget Board. They have every version of the budget from last session and previous sessions on their website, and they have a lot of additional publications and resources that really analyze and look at trends, both spending trends and other performance measures of the various agencies. So those are some great websites.
Great. One of the last things that was talked about in the SVP Responds last week was the rainy day fund. And I understand we're looking at a pretty sizable gap in the budget, which could grow by the time the comptroller comes out with their analysis because of the impact on the economy from COVID. I don't know, does anybody want to take a stab at telling us basically what the rainy day fund is and how that fight happens? Stephanie, is that still kind of within your background, if you want to explain what the rainy day fund is?
The rainy day fund is kind of like it's the savings account for the state. I think by now the state has about $10 to $11 billion in the rainy day fund. I think the majority of the dollars that go into the rainy day fund are from oil and gas. And it has been something that the legislature has traditionally not tapped into. It's usually for one-time expenses. And so we're assuming this will be the session that everybody's going to assume if any session they're going to tap into that money, they will. Right now, like I said, they have between 10 and 11. We already have a $4 billion deficit for the current biennium. That's not even looking at the next biennium. So while the rainy day fund is large, there is still a very large gap this session and last session, or this session and the coming session. And so we'll have to figure out other ways to kind of fill those gaps. It's something that they would not, most likely would not completely deplete, but use a 50% or a percentage of it to fill, once again, one-time expenses rather than reoccurring expenses to fill kind of holes in agency operating budget.
And my understanding is it takes a super majority vote actually for them to tap into the rainy day fund. I can't remember if it's 2/3 or 3/5, or I don't know if it, but it is a high bar to get over to actually access those rainy day funds.
Correct. Usually the budget has a good percentage of the legislators vote in favor of the budget. So, that's something, especially this session, I don't think it's going to be a challenge to get a super majority.
Before we go off kind of process and budget, obviously certainly related to the budget, one of the things we exited last session with a huge success on school finance reform, but without any guarantee of funding into the future. So that part of that funding battle is going to be over sustaining the progress that we've made on education financing. So why don't I go to Kate first, and then I'll let Erica, if you guys want to jump in with anything about process or the budget to add your thoughts on.
Yeah, well, I can start, and then happy to have Erica chime in. Again, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation today. And you're right, we scored a huge win with school funding for our students last session. When session wrapped at the end of May 2019, we had about $11.5 billion going toward public schools and tax relief, so property taxes, which fund a large part of your school bill. So when you see your tax bill, you can feel good paying into your public school system. There was uncertainty when the bill passed about, look, a lot of these programs are intended to grow over time as student outcomes improve, as we start rewarding our very best educators to teach in harder to staff schools. Those programs all cost an increasing amount of money between now and 10 years from now. The School Finance Commission, which took place over the course of 2018 and really paved the way for House Bill 3, that school finance reform budget and bill. The revenue discussions in the School Finance Commission did not really take hold the way that several advocates were hoping that they would, and just tended to pass the torch. So we are now in this position where it is a little bit rockier than anyone would have expected across all agencies. Stephanie mentioned that the Texas Education Agency, TEA, was held harmless from that 5% budget cut that others were asked to submit, but we still fully expect that funding will be under a microscope in 2021, and agencies will need to explain where every penny is going. Commit, it should be no surprise. We feel strongly that you can't put your money in a better position than funding public school students, because a strong economic recovery begins with a strong education foundation. But yes, we are expecting a more tense session than we were originally planning when 2019 happened. That said, we have only heard reassuring things from legislators all across the state who are invested in House Bill 3. They spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on getting that bill passed, and they certainly do not want to go backward.
Thank you, Kate. Erica, would you like to add your thoughts?
Yeah, well, just really quickly, and again, thank you guys for having me on the panel. I'm thrilled to be a guest and to learn from our guest as well. The only thing I would add there is, I think our position aligns pretty neatly with commits around, we want to see those continued investments. One thing related to the process that Stephanie mentioned as well is just the Legislative Budget Board actually also did publish a report that identified additional revenue streams that the state could tap. If we are thinking about, when we have to, for lots of reasons, but especially because of COVID, looking at additional revenue sources. And that, as Kate has mentioned, that was a gap in that school finance bill, is that long-term sustainable funding. And Texas, we rank 43rd in per pupil spending across the country. And so there is a big gap to fill there.
That's a really good point. And although, Texas is a state that when you talk about additional revenue sources, it tends to result in extreme responses depending on where people find themselves on the political spectrum. But I think it does raise a good point, is educating yourself and actually having a solution, not going in with just problems, and knowing there's resources out there that can help you craft a solution, at least suggestions for a solution, because it's not great to go to the legislators have a lot of people coming to them who just want to talk about their problems and expect them to fix it. You need to spend some time thinking about what the solution would be that you could offer whenever you're engaging with legislators. So let's turn our attention to that. For those who are joining us, we wanted to make this a how-to. So let's talk about, for an organization that hasn't traditionally engaged in advocacy, wants to actually start building relationships with elected officials, where do you start? Where do you even start? So to kick us off on that discussion, how about Kate? I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, you start by not being overwhelmed. I know we spent the first 30 minutes of this discussion about things like the budget and things that can be a bit overwhelming for your average constituent, but I will just say that there are so many tools available to help you kind of curve your learning curve and make it an easier to dive into issue. Your first step is just figuring out who your representatives and senators are. And I would say that you can think about two different groups. I'm going to go off of Colette's think in threes and modify it to think in twos. But you have your representative and senator who you are a constituent of. So where you or your business has their primary residence, you should know who your representative and senator are for those addresses, and you should reach out and get to know them, share what you do, what you're interested in, and really what your organization is striving to accomplish in this region. The second set of representatives and senators that you should be thinking about forming relationships with are those who really sit on those key committees that you have an interested stake in. So for Commit, that's our Public Education Committee in the House and our Education Committee in the Senate. But it can be anything from higher ed or workforce. There are lists of committees on that Texas Legislature Online website that we keep referring to. And you really just want to get to know the members and their staff. As a former staffer, legislators are charged with remembering and studying a million different issues on any given day. And staffers really are the backbone of the office. So typically, each office has designated staffers for particular policy areas. And it's just as simple as calling them up and saying, hey, who should I speak to about issues concerning education, or who should I speak to about issues concerning broadband? And they'll point you exactly to who you need to go to. And then you can just start sharing your story. That would be my biggest urge for you guys, is that you just lean into your expertise that you have. Legislators are not full-time legislators in Texas. They have jobs back home. Sometimes their job will overlap with what you do, other times it won't. And you just should feel confident bringing forth your value and expertise and really letting staff know what you hope to accomplish. Like Dan said, focusing on solutions is always met with a sigh of relief within the Capitol, but it does not have to be overwhelming. There are so many tools out there. And then of course, if you're just thinking, I don't even know, I just need somebody to tell me when I need to jump and how I need to jump, Dallas has a wealth of advocacy organizations in every single policy area you could dream of. And so just poke around on the internet, look for advocacy groups like the United Way or like Commit, and they can help kind of soften that landing for you. So we can really point you to, look, there's a bill on the floor and you need to engage now. We can make those jumps easier for you. I think Leadership ISD has a tool that does that as well. So just know that there are lots of people that want to help.
Great, thank you. I think one resource that the audience might be interested in is how do you go about identifying which committees, because the committee names don't always tell you all about the jurisdiction they have. And my recommendation is you can actually go and look in the last legislative session. Everything, all the bills and everything from the last session is still up on the Texas Legislature online. And you can search in the bills for keywords for legislation that impacts your area, such as education, and pull up, and there'll be a whole basically chronology of how the bill went through the legislative process, and it will tell you what committee that bill was assigned to. And committees can always change, and it's possible, especially with COVID, with the constraints on meetings, that they might do some streamlined committees this year. We're not quite sure how, but at least it'll give you a sense of in a regular session where typical topics would go to what committees. You can also pull up the members, and a lot of times members serve consecutive terms on the same committee, and find out who the sponsor was, and maybe who the key legislators are on specific issues, because they like to specialize in a particular area because there's just so many different things. One of the things you mentioned was about staff. Colette, can you tell us a little bit about just how the typical legislator's office is staffed, and who at the staff level, who plays what role, and who they might want to be reaching out to, because obviously the members themselves have a limited amount of time on their schedule.
Sure. And one of the things I wanted to go back to on TLO is when you're looking at committees, you can actually even find previous witnesses who testified for, on, or against a particular bill. So a lot of times when you are looking at it, if you want to find out in previous sessions if a particular organization was for a bill and where they might stand, you can find that list of witnesses. So but generally, a legislative office has, the member, a chief of staff, which is, kind of does everything from making sure that the member gets to the floor, or, gets to their committee meetings if they're a chair or a vice chair or something, and kind of keeps the office running. To you've got a legislative director who really kind of guides things and is more of the policy person, who is letting the member know, about the different statutes, et cetera, that actually relate to any kind of bills that have been filed. And that's often maybe the first person that you would go and talk to. There are other folks in the office who, as Kate said, are subject matter experts who handle a particular issue for that member. And so they go back into, they help the member actually get educated about those kinds of things. And it's important when you're going to legislative offices, oftentimes we as lobbyists or as an organization, have one-pagers suggesting to a member, how they should vote for a particular bill. Obviously, with our clients, objective in mind. And so it would be important if you have a one-pager to have that information very concisely written on the particular one-pager, so that you can give it to them, because oftentimes they're either, you know, walking to the chambers or walking to the floor to vote or something. If you can hand them something that very concisely outlines, you know, what your organization, how you would like them to think about things, that's very, very helpful. And also leave it in their office, because they generally take binders home at night and really study these kinds of things. And like I said, you know, between it's actually really the second and the third reading. There's always, you know what's kind of coming up on your committee, and then as well as on the floor when it gets later into the session. So those members are actually reviewing that information the previous day or the previous evening. So.
Thank you. Erica, any thoughts on just getting over that initial hump and getting started on engaging with the legislature?
Yeah, no, I think all of this is absolutely really great advice. I would echo Kate's sentiment around like not being overwhelmed or intimidated. This is the people's house. They are our representatives, and they are expecting to hear from you. I think some key things to also highlight is, you know, if you are a constituent, make sure that when you reach out either by phone, I actually suggest calling offices to schedule meetings. That tends to move things along more quickly. And see every opportunity as a relationship building opportunity, because so much of what happens in the Texas Capitol, you know, as in so many of our lives, is relationship based. And so I would suggest, you know, doing as much research as you can on that particular representative or senator. If you can find, you know, maybe the background of their staff, that would be helpful too. And I would also just, you know, come in with a bit of confidence in knowing that you are an expert in one, like your own lived experience, right, as an individual, but also an expert in the issue that you're working on. So, you know, in our case, we are going to dive deep into education. One thing that I think is also really important as organizations who serve others is to bring those voices along to the table. So it's incredibly important. We talk about the head and the heart a ton when we talk about advocacy and policy work. You have to appeal to that, you know, intellectual space of like, how do we solve this problem? Or, you know, what are the steps that we want to take? But the heart is also the place where you move people towards action. And so we like to complement our kind of, you know, technical expertise, the one-pagers, we do that stuff. And then we also bring in constituents, parents, students to tell the story of their experience, because nothing can paint a picture better than, you know, someone who is directly impacted by the issue that you're working on.
Great. Stephanie, anything to add, tips to get started?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what Erica said. I love what she said about how it's based on relationships. I think sometimes people get discouraged if they're not able to meet with a legislator. In some cases, it's even more important to meet with a staffer because they really are the person that's able to put something in front of a legislator when it's most appropriate. And I focus on really building a rapport when I schedule that first meeting. Yes, you want to talk about your issue, but because they have back-to-back meetings, it's really building a rapport and helping. The goal is really to get them to remember you so that they're able to think back to your meeting. Maybe it's by connecting over who you're the alum, like maybe you went to the same university or had something in common. But really building a relationship so that it's focused on long term. And in most cases, you're Debbie Downer, but your policy isn't going to get passed in one session, and you're not going to really, you know, get everything you want in one session. It's going to be focused on incremental change. And so building a relationship that can go with the office long term is really going to be important, and do what you can to serve as a resource so that you are honest with them and they feel like they can come to you when they need something, maybe just beyond that one issue, but kind of in that same space.
Yeah, I think it's great. Relationship building, tapping into your board members or others is a good source to see where there are personal relationships, because I think it helps ease the introduction and also can be good in maintaining a longer term relationship. And also suggests that people check social media to see. Not all legislators are whizzes at social media, but more and more they are becoming very comfortable with social media. And so following them on social media, and it's also, most of the advocacy organizations are very adept at using social media, and it's probably become the most timely way to get information that's breaking news on an issue that's important to you. Finding out the organizations that are working in that area, making sure you're following them on social media, so that lobbying and advocacy is all about information flow, and you've got to get yourself into the information flow to really be effective at advocacy. Colette, did you want to add something?
Well, to your point, social media, I mean, Twitter is a great place to find things. Sometimes, people react very quickly by, tweeting something out. So it really is kind of real time. So make sure that you
for better and for worse.
Yes, for better or for worse. And then, while we're talking about the upcoming 87th legislative session, and obviously COVID is figuring very prominently in this. It's important to make sure that even outside of legislative sessions, because we are every other year, particularly if it's a new member or a member that you don't have a relationship with, go to their office. They really do want to hear from their constituents. I door knocked with several of the members during this re-election season, and I can't tell you how many people said, please call our office. Let us know, what you're needing, what you're thinking, because particularly these things that impact their constituents, like education, like healthcare, like economics, are really important for them to hear. So make sure that you're building those relationships, kind of always. And in as much as they may be sworn in and then kind of sent back home for a couple of weeks or something like that, some people may be a bit reticent to meet in their offices, but you may be able to have a better luck trying to meet in their district offices, and even talking to their district person, who sometimes does go with them to Austin, but oftentimes stays back at the district so that they can be in touch with constituents. So don't forget those avenues also.
That's interesting to raise too, especially given this year when there's a lot of talk that they could gavel in on the 12th, have some organizational swear everyone in, have some organizational meetings, and then potentially gavel out for 3 or 4 weeks while the hopefully worst of the surge moves past us, and then so they could be back in their home districts actually for the first 3 or 4 weeks of the session. So you've got a meeting, you've actually called, they said, yes, the legislator would love to meet with you either in person or maybe more likely right now by Zoom. What advice do you have for having an effective meeting? And I'll start with Erica on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So yeah, I think first and foremost, like understanding what your ask is. Making sure that you have a clear message. So one of the things with policy that I find, especially in working with people who aren't as connected to the policy process, is that it can be really complex. And so get your elevator speech down, have your technical pieces like we've referenced, a one-pager, make it clear like what it is that you're asking that representative to do. And then make sure to leave as much information as possible behind, things that, as Colette mentioned, and others that they can reference and continue reading. And part of the relationship building, it doesn't always have to be that you're meeting with them in person. It's, following up and saying like, hey, I thought of you. We had a conversation about, early childhood. Here's a study that I read, really interesting. Take a look at these 3 things. So following up with, any information that you think will be helpful. If you're at a nonprofit or another kind of organization, if there are press releases, if you're having, we often host community meetings or topical issues. We've done, like a school finance 101 or other things that you think those legislators would be interested in hearing from constituents or from other speakers that you're having. That's a really great opportunity to continue that engagement. And yeah, it's following up. It's also, I often try to also get as much information from them as possible, right? So one thing that I usually ask members is, in addition to helping them understand my ask, is asking them to help me understand what their priorities are. So as you're building your advocacy strategy, you can really navigate the space of like, okay, well, I know that this representative or this senator really cares about this part of our policy agenda, and so I'm going to go really hard on in this office, or I'm going to follow up with a lot more information here. So it's a give and take. I would definitely say right now, especially like trying to get as much information from those offices will be really helpful, because it's going to feel like we're going to be really disconnected, and it's harder, right, when you're not actually physically present.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point too. You have to accept that there's a lot of work the legislators have to get done. They are part-time. They don't get really paid very well for the time that it takes to really actually serve as a legislator. And sometimes they have to say no, because they're either their dance card is full, or maybe they don't think that they're the most best positioned member to take on a particular issue for you, but they can still be helpful to you. And as I think Colette or someone else mentioned, look at it over the long term. They could be back in the next session and be in a different position and still try to maintain that relationship and keep a connection with them. Kate, did you want to add anything just in terms of how to build an effective long-term relationship and effective meetings?
No, I think everyone has covered it. I did see a question in the chat, like, well, how do we do that with COVID? And I found staffers to be really receptive to Zoom, especially as the pandemic has dragged on. In the beginning, like March, April, May, they were like, I'm good with a phone call. But there really is something about being face-to-face with staffers, especially as you're in the beginning phases of developing that relationship, just being able to see the person, get to connect. So always make it an option. And then if people would rather take a phone call, they will tell you that, and it's not a big deal.
I do want to add that there was a great discussion on SVP Responds about, accepting that this, in the age of COVID, probably it will have some practical impact. They have to work through rules, and that will be done in the initial meeting when they actually pass the rules that govern the session. They have to address some things. For instance, I don't think the current rules allow for remote committee meetings. They could actually provide remote access to committee meetings, or you actually might be able to sit in your living room and actually get more information this session than you've been able to access in the past without being down in Austin. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think from a substantive perspective too, Evan Smith called it last week, the Texas recovery session, that if it's really not dealing with the economic recovery post-COVID, which could include issues like broadband. That's become obviously broadband access has become a much higher profile issue because of remote learning, because of healthcare access. That's a real recovery issue, and framing and really helping people understand within where your organization works, how has COVID affected you, and how does that intersect with what they're going to be dealing with over the legislative session?
And I just want to add, so they may not have remote testimony available during committee, but you can always watch the committees while they're live, real time through TLO. If you go onto it on the right side, generally it will tell you what committees are having meetings on a particular day, and then it will ask you if you want to watch it real time if a committee is meeting, or if you want to go back to archives. So you can watch it real time.
Great. Thank you, Colette. Let's talk about for organizations that are interested. So we've all talked about this, and you can do a lot that is involved in advocacy that does not stray over the line into lobbying. And given the nonprofit status that many of our audience's organizations have, they have to be very aware of where that line is. But there's a lot you can do when in creating awareness of your organization, your needs among legislators, the impact you're having, being a substantive resource to them, an expert resource to them in your area that doesn't stray over into lobbying. Once there's a specific bill that's doing something and you want to weigh in support or against that specific bill, you do get into lobbying, which for organizations that are willing to take that on and take that step, how do you get information about specific bills that have been introduced and what information is available out there? Kate, why don't I ask you to speak a little to that?
Yeah, there's a ton of information out there. I'm going to go back to that TLO website. Maybe it'll become everyone's homepage at the close of this session. But it will just tell you there's a searchable list, so you can look up any bill you want once you know a bill number. You can just type it in, and then you can even set up alerts. So you can have an email notification anytime that bill is set to receive a hearing or if it gets voted out of committee. And you can really follow a bill all the way through the process. You can read through any amendments that are tacked on. So if somebody tries to change the portion you're really excited about, it's important to know about that and to try to figure out who was behind that amendment and what kind of conversation should be had as a next step. The other thing that you will be able to watch and look for on TLO is the fiscal note, which is really important this year. And that just talks about how much money a bill costs or what the potential impact of legislation is. And Stephanie, maybe you can tell them a little bit more about how a fiscal note comes to be.
So that was pretty much the main part, the fiscal note. So it really identifies not just how much was allocated for a pot of money, but then also any type of additional expenses that may cost an agency to implement. So increase of an FTE over a certain number of years. Anything that they may need to purchase to launch a program, kind of the startup cost. This is something that every bill that receives a committee hearing is given a fiscal note. And in a lot of cases, it provides an amount if it's going to be a large amount, or it may just say no significant impact. And so that just really signifies that it's something that an agency can absorb that cost within their existing staff time or the money that's been allocated to them.
Stephanie, unexpected fiscal note in terms of expenditure levels can be the death knell or significantly raise the bar for legislation has to clear in order to get considered. Is it possible to influence that process of the development of the fiscal note, or is that done kind of behind closed doors and difficult to influence?
The Legislative Budget Board develops that, and that's something that usually a legislator can talk to the LBB staffer that's developing that fiscal note to try and massage it, maybe give them some more information on what they're proposing, maybe give them details on what another agency is doing where they could kind of share that data to really provide more of a context. Just once again, LBB, the staffers do a great job, but they may not be familiar with all of the nuances of a bill that's being proposed and all of the different aspects of an agency's responsibilities and performances.
Good, thanks. We got a question about just, overall number of bills that we're expecting versus a normal year versus what we're looking for COVID. I think that we have to get to the opening of the session and really understand how they're going to organize the committees and exactly how they're going to get work done, because I think just the practical issues involved with COVID could limit the pieces of legislation that are actually able to get through the funnel this year. And I invite our panelists to comment on that, but also there was a comment on SVP Responds about a lot might be done through budget riders versus the regular legislation and regular legislative order. And, do you have any thoughts on that and what actually might be going through the budget process versus maybe a regular jurisdictional committee process? So I'll open that up if anyone would like to jump in.
Well, I can address bills. I think I may have said it at the beginning. As of this morning, there are 1,087 bills that have been filed. Generally, in every session, there's, gosh, anywhere from 7 to, I think, when I was looking this morning, there had been 10,000 that were filed last session. And generally only about 20% get through and are actually passed. I don't know the 1,000, how that trends with, you know, previous years. And not to go off too much into a rabbit hole, but it's always interesting and fun to know about the numbers on the bills. Like, you know, 1, 2, and 3 generally either on a House bill or a Senate bill tend to be the ones that have to do with, you know, finance or education or, you know, statewide impact. And so those numbers are reserved for those statewide impact bills. A lot of bills are being filed right now. I can't say it's a hard and fast rule, but sometimes those don't necessarily make it through the process. And so it's always interesting to watch. But I think they're probably, apparently members have been told that, you know, you're not going to get a whole lot passed this year because of the focus on the emergency items, particularly due to COVID. That's not going to stop people from passing bills, because I think, as Stephanie said before, it does take 2 or 3 cycles for a bill sometimes to get passed for a particular issue. So, yeah.
Just add, I think even though they may not, a lot of bills may not move through the committee, what could potentially happen is that the bills that are actually getting a hearing may become Christmas trees, where they get a lot of amendments added on the floor. People are already creating amendments and turning their bills into amendments where they're able to add anything if it's germane. And so what could happen is that anything, a bill that could have easily passed or quickly passed may have longer debates. And the legislators may not even know what they're passing because there are going to be so many amendments that are getting added onto it. I think it's going to be an interesting session. And it's also going to be one for those that are very strategic to see how you can kind of get things added on the floor.
Anybody have thoughts on just how you are thinking about doing your job in the age of COVID and being effective? I mean, many of you would be spending significant time down in Austin. We don't know if that's possible. Lots of your organization would normally be organizing, you know, days on the Hill where you're bringing people into Austin to have constituent relationships, volunteers, you know, buses going down to the Capitol, press conferences on the Capitol steps, things like that. You know, thoughts about how you're going to try to maintain your effectiveness in a very, very different legislative session.
Well,
Kate, you spend a lot of time in Austin, so.
Just like you opened it up, their lobby days will be slim to none, which makes me personally sad because there's so much excitement about, like Erica said, everyone coming into the people's house and getting to fight for issues that they really believe in. Personally, I will be sad to miss Rattlesnake Week, which always happens at the Capitol, and it's just like a fun, crazy few days where there are a bunch of rattlesnakes and rattlesnake handlers inside the Capitol building. So there are just those intangible fun, only Texas things that we will miss out on in COVID. And who knows if that will maintain through the duration of session, or if you might see things start to loosen up in April or May. But Commit is really relying on virtual meetings right now. And we're trying to make sure that we are a conduit for school districts, higher ed institutions to connect directly to their legislators. So I often find that legislators and staff are happy to hear from me, but they are thrilled to hear from practitioners who are on the ground teaching in classrooms or advising students or really troubleshooting the college enrollment decline. So we're really focusing on how we can go about making sure that members, legislators hear directly from constituents about issues that are important to them. And Commit is working to be even more concise and crisp, because the feedback we're getting from staff is it's hard to keep everything straight. Their inboxes are overwhelmed, just like I imagine everyone else's inboxes are overwhelmed. So when I send attachments, I also send a 3 bullet point list in the body of an email saying like, here are the takeaways from this attachment. Call me if you want to talk live about it, because it can just be something that gets filed away in the internet ether. And you want to do everything you can to make it really easy for staff to get the gist of your issue and for it to be easy for them to see a path on why they personally should get behind it.
And I would add, we Leadership ISD, we have a network of about, we have a very wide like online network of about 8,000 people, and then another 2,000 people who are either currently participating in our program or who are fellows. And I keep seeing this actually as an opportunity. Like, yes, it's going to be really hard, but in terms of accessibility, we are actually still going to do a lobby day. It's going to be virtual. We're going to do a briefing. We're going to, make sure people understand what's happening. I think part of what I see our responsibility is to like make sure that we are giving that information to people, who are affected by those decisions. And, I've coordinated when I was on the state board, coordinated kids visiting the state capitol, and the logistics behind that is actually really, really complicated. So the virtual opportunities are actually really great. Like, I think that there's also, the possibility that we engage just a larger amount of people through a virtual setting. So I think there is a little bit of silver lining and some opportunities there to engage more individuals who may not, traditionally have had that access.
I think I really go back to the very first conversation where we're talking about how do you start and the importance of really understanding who the core advocacy organizations who are working in your space this year more than others. I think because of the bandwidth challenges, the communications challenges we're all going to have, where you're just not running into people as much on a basis, and able to kind of what I call kind of have spontaneous collaborations, check things out. Everything's got to be it just takes more scheduling to have every communication, and I think it raises the importance of being connected with the organizations that are really the must talk to organizations for legislators who are working in a specific area, and get tied into those organizations, because it'll be very challenging. I think for constituents, they'll always want to make time for constituents, but without that constituent relationship, it's just going to be incredible amounts of incredible demand on time, and the difficulties coordinating interactions up in the Capitol.
And as much as you have access to the staffers by having cell phone numbers, a couple of the calls that I was on last week with some of the members, they readily offered a cell phone number for either themselves or one of their staff members, so that you could get in touch with them. And in speaking to a staff member yesterday, she indicated, asking people, are you all going to set up the Zoom call? Or are you expecting our office to set up the Zoom call? So if you have, a subscription to Zoom and you can get other people on and all that sort of stuff, the easier you can make it for staff members by saying, let's decide on a time. I will send you the Zoom link. So all you've got to do is click on it and send an actual meeting invitation, so they don't have to scroll back through their emails. It just makes it easy, because they are going to have so much going on, and they usually have so mumuch going on, during session. So just make it as easy and, 1, 2, 3 for them as possible.
And I want to, I don't know if we reinforce this enough. First rule of meeting with either a member or their staff is start out with being very respectful of their time. It's really my guide has always been really no meeting should need to go longer than 15 minutes. You really need to kind of get in, really be clear. As Erica said, be clear on your ask. And if they want to sit and chit chat and everything, and they're asking you questions, that's great. It's fine. You don't have to say we're up to 50 minutes and you have to cut it off. But really, if you go in with that attitude of looking, trying to accomplish your objectives in 10 to 15 minutes, you will, I can tell you, you will not, you will be high on the list for getting a follow-up meeting. If you go on and drone on and on for 45 minutes, it's going to be difficult to get that next meeting. Okay, let's, I don't know, we don't have any questions. I think we've hit the questions that have come in on the chat. I do want to make a plug for the Alliance for Justice and their Boulder Advocacy project. Certainly the very helpful, their mission is to help nonprofits become engaged in advocacy in a way that is compliant and is meant to ensure that there are no threats to their nonprofit tax status. But they also have a lot of practical tips. So I refer you to Boulder Advocacy's website. They actually just started a great podcast series, and they have actually a person based in Texas, based in Dallas, Natalie Ossenford, who is just a phone call away for any nonprofit who's looking to learn more about how to get effectively engaged in advocacy to advance their organization's goals. Why don't we talk about I got a question coming in from the audience from someone who I know personally is very interested in the other constitutional duty that is of importance for this legislature, which is the process of redistricting. So although it's not quite clear when the census is going to be wrapped up and the information is going to come down from the U.S. Census Bureau that actually guides the reapportionment and redistricting that will take place, can anybody have any thoughts just about where does redistricting fit into what the legislature is going to be working on? And will it be something that consumes everything? Will it be something that probably comes later in the year? How is that going to work?
I'll jump in and take the first stab at it. And so I was on, I think, one of the Texas Tribune webinars, and Senator Huffman was talking about not necessarily knowing when the census information is going to be released or come out, but she indicated that, you know, as I was indicating earlier, pretty much if something is not kind of in the works by April, then, you know, it may be later on. And so I'm thinking that, and I've heard different things about when the census numbers will come out. I've heard as late as July 15th. So that would necessarily throw us into a special session for this year. And so it may not be something that gets tackled during a regular session. And then a special session, for those of you who are not aware, so the governor can call a special session for 30 days. It can be less than 30 days after a regular session is adjourned. And I've heard historically that, you know, there have been as many as, you know, 5 or 6 special sessions after a session. So the thought is that redistricting may be tackled during a special session this year. So, and it's sure to be, I'm sure, contentious, because you know, the Democrats did think that they were going to be able to flip the House. And so that would have allowed them to sort of be in control of redrawing the maps. But since that didn't happen, you know, it'll be interesting to see if the maps are really redrawn drastically.
Anyone else want to add anything about either redistricting or just the outlook for special sessions this year? We're all on a wait and see mode. I think there's an assumption that there will be at least one special session and probably multiple special sessions. And the question is whether anyone will flee for the north of the border to Oklahoma and they'll have to engage the Texas Marshals this time around. So let's just, while we have time left, I'll watch for additional questions to come up, but why don't we talk about just kind of some of the outlook for some key issues. We had a little bit of discussion about education, but you know, Erica, do you want to add anything about kind of the outlook for education? Anything particular that your organization is going to be focused on this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I feel like this has been said already, but just so much of the work of this session, you know, will have to be tied to COVID. We're certainly thinking about our messaging in light of, well, how are the education issues that we advocate for, how are they further impacted by COVID? And that's just what we've been hearing too, is just like, there's not going to be a whole lot of room for additional conversation or priorities. Given that, our two biggest priorities are actually sustaining and continuing investments in public education. We want to protect the investments made last session. And as I talked about earlier, encourage and urge our legislators to really consider, like, what are those additional revenue sources, whether it's the rainy day fund or something else, but how do we really get to par with other states? And then the second biggest priority for us is addressing the COVID learning slide. So part of our work is really focused on racial justice and racial equity. And what we have seen over and over is that Black and Brown students are consistently at the bottom of the achievement gap. With COVID-19, all of those disparities have been exacerbated. Like, there's continued challenges that families have. And so some of what we'll be asking the legislature to do is to consider, are there social emotional supports that we can provide to students? Student mental health has been something that we haven't really talked about very much in the state house and the state legislature. And so given the challenges that we have currently with COVID and also the political and racial climate, how can we better meet the needs of students from a mental health perspective? The digital divide is one that comes up consistently as well, even in urban areas. Many low-income families, which tend to be families of color, don't have access to broadband or reliable broadband. And then we have some other priorities that are more kind of, longer term. We're going to push legislation that actually centers students in the policymaking process. We've got some ideas. We're working with a few legislators on authoring bills about that. And then strengthening early learning opportunities and supporting our teachers would be the last priority for us. Not the last in terms of not important, but on our list, because that is huge as well.
Thanks, Erica. I think the broadband issue, even Evan Smith's comments last week when he talked about broadband kind of went right to the rural versus urban gap. And I think if we've learned anything from COVID is it has really highlighted the gap that exists within urban areas in access to broadband, whether it's because of coverage or because of affordability or hardware access, things like that. So I think that is undoubtedly going to be a huge issue. And I think it's also one that ties over to healthcare and then also can play a big role in terms of the state's competitiveness going forward. Our broadband infrastructure. Stephanie, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so COVID response, like you've already talked about, is going to be a big issue. So looking at how various agencies or programs responded to COVID. So unemployment insurance obviously is going to be reviewed to see how we can streamline and improve that system. The United Way system is also hoping to talk about 211 and see how we can improve the standards for 211, since that is something that the governor and most elected officials directed individuals to 211. That is a place where individuals can get connected to the services that they need in the community, their specific community when they need it, and how can we improve it so that everybody has a better response and what they need. Policies that reduce spending or increases revenue. So something that could be discussed, Medicaid expansion, I think we've already talked about that. Other policies that implement some of the waivers that we saw at the federal level. So maybe it's reducing the amount of paperwork that families need to submit to ensure that they keep their health insurance. Any other types of continued lax regulations or rules. The passage of the Family First Act. So looking at the child welfare system to see how more preventative services, we're hoping that that's something that will be a priority for the legislature. That last session, it was something that Senator West actually passed a bill to require the state to develop a strategic plan and an implementation. And then criminal justice reform, I think that's something that Gromer talked about last time. And the Legislative Black Caucus, reducing disparities is definitely going to be one of our priorities. Also, going back to workforce issues, and then reasonable payday and auto title loan rules are always one of our priorities. We focus on education, financial stability, and health. So it is a very broad legislative agenda.
I'm going to stay with you, Stephanie, because we had an issue that, or a question that came in, and I think you might be the best position to answer it, but I'll ask others if they have thoughts. But for nonprofits on the call, how can they encourage funders to be more supportive of advocacy and actually provide funding to support advocacy activities? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. There's actually a large coalition of funders. It was previously called TAC, the Texas Education Grant Making Advocacy Consortium. Now it's called Philanthropy Advocates, I believe, where they fund seed research to help legislators to receive the data and the statistics that they need in hopes of then developing legislation and then encouraging the conversation for the next legislative session. A lot of those funders, I think there's about 30 or 40 from across the state that are a part of that coalition. A lot of the funders are here in Dallas. I think my suggestion when an individual or an organization is looking to fund their advocacy project, it's when you submit a grant, maybe focused on direct service, include some funding to ask about changing and pushing for legislative policies. Because that is going to help contribute to the long-term changes that you're hoping to enact, and make that clear tie. And you're just going to have to really be mindful and about the outcomes that you're wanting to determine with your advocacy efforts. Sometimes that's really the biggest challenge with a lot of agencies is they really focus on output with that advocacy grant, but really trying to identify how can you help build that momentum or the movement to make. There are some great resources out there. I think it's the Annie Foundation that talks about developing an advocacy evaluation program. And yeah, so it is a little challenging, but I think more foundations and funders are moving into that space.
Yeah, I've seen that as well through some work I've done with some funders that are there. There's actually probably more than you would think who are willing to fund advocacy. I think it's figuring out how you can actually make that pitch. I'd say look at Texas 2036, which is becoming a great source of information of data to really show kind of data at the state level and understanding, which knobs are you trying to turn and what's the impact and outcome you're looking for. With Texas 2036, I think it can be much easier to actually tie something to a specific outcome and a measurement that you'll be able to show progress over time. And that could make your ask and request for funding, I think, stronger. So, Colette, I'm going to go to you on this because I know you actually do work with municipalities. We haven't talked about an issue that's likely to be a big fight and might be of interest to some of our organizations who are actually kind of advocating on a local level. And it's this whole issue of state preemption or local control, whatever you want to call it. But the idea that the state would override it's happened in the city ordinance that have been requiring family and medical leave, or maybe setting a minimum wage, and that the fact that the possibility that the state would preempt that action and take that authority away from local municipalities. Do you want to comment about how that might play out this year?
You must have been reading my mind, because I was going to say some of the things that aren't necessarily, for nonprofits. One is these buzzwords, local control, and so it is interesting that say this, the leadership doesn't necessarily like the feds to come in and say, hey, this is what your state should be doing. But sometimes states want to actually say what cities and counties should be doing. And so, yes, it is huge as far as making sure, you know, everything from property taxes and, you know, how, you know, what kicks you into actually putting a referendum for everyone to vote for property taxes to, yes, paid sick leave, or, you know, what you can do in your own cities with your own constituents. So it is sure to be a fight. As well as, you know, tax funder paid lobbying. That's going to be another, you know, fight that may not have the sort of the COVID and economics piece of it and healthcare, but it's something that the municipalities are really concerned about. So it'll come up, it'll be a fight. Last session, there was a lobbyist bill that came up and, you know, it didn't make it through. It got defeated at the very end. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes, but there is going to be a local control fight, I'm sure, this session.
Yeah, I think any nonprofit that's working in the area of social or economic justice at the local level needs to educate themselves and be aware of this battle over local control. Over
yeah, and I'm not aware of a like one. Prisma has been so good at putting up, you know, websites that you can that actually, you know, discusses the issue. So if anybody knows where that is. Besides, you know, the newspapers of, you know, what's going on. There was something in Dallas Morning News yesterday about tax funder paid lobbying and giving cities a chance. So I think newspaper is probably the best way to find that right now.
Anybody have thoughts on the housing crisis, and especially given the relationship to COVID and whether housing will be on the agenda for the legislature for this year? Go ahead, Stephanie.
United Way has become increasingly more focused on housing, knowing that individuals need housing first, right, before they're able to really stabilize an individual in their situation and to receive other services and support. There have been a few bills that have been filed around housing. A lot of it is more at the federal level, just because a lot of the rules are at the federal level or at the local level. I believe Senator West has filed a bill around community land trusts, and there are some fights. I know previously there was some changes that a state agency was trying to make to really prohibit individuals with a criminal background from getting some public housing. So there may be more efforts to try and limit eligibility, but I think the majority of that's really at the federal level. I don't know, what additional funding the state has around with COVID dollars, CARES dollars that they would need to allocate out. Evictions is that we would like to focus on, because the eviction data isn't great, and that would need some type of legislative change to hopefully increase the transparency around the data and really updating some of the systems, the countywide systems. But unfortunately, I don't think this is.
Okay. Last question, and I will not speculate about I won't identify my partner who submitted this, or SVP partner, not life partner, or speculate why they're interested, but they'd like to know that, especially given the potential as a revenue source, any likelihood that either marijuana or gambling legalization are going to move forward in this session. Does anybody want to take that? It's I would say that in Texas, I cannot imagine that. I think that either, well, maybe the gambling issue, I don't know, but it seems to maybe Oklahoma would be funding opposition to that, so to stop people from driving north to go do their gambling, at least for people in Dallas.
Yeah.
So Well, I really appreciate, we are coming up close to the end. I wanted to give Prisma the opportunity to make some final announcements for SVP. But thank you so much. This has been a really interesting conversation. I hope that our audience took something away from it and are inspired and to get more engaged. Each of your organizations is doing great things in Austin. And let's hope for a very productive legislative session that actually focuses on the needs of the citizens of Texas and delivers good things at the end of the day. So with that, Prisma, I invite you to come back on and close us out.
Thank you so much, Dan, for leading this conversation, and to all of our panelists here today. I know I've been taking a lot of notes, dropping a lot of links in the chat, and so we will collect all of those. And of course, the recording will be available shortly after this session ends. But I did want to thank all of our panelists for your time and energy here today. And of course, thank our sponsors once again, Something Good Consulting Group and Wright Knatzer Law for support of these workshops. Of course, I always encourage people to post on social media. Feel free to do that even after the session. And I would like to mention that, now is the time to give to your favorite organization, give to Social Venture Partners Dallas as well. During this end of year period, we always see an increase, and hopefully 2020 will be no different, where we see an increase in donations coming in for end of year. And at SVP Dallas, we have a $50,000 match. And so, you can amplify that impact by giving to SVP Dallas. And I believe the link is in the chat as well. So you can follow that link, and your donation will be matched up to $50,000. So thank you so much for all of you being here today. I know that 2020 has definitely had an impact on all of us. And I know that 2021 will definitely be pivotal, and we'll see what happens in January with the start of the legislative session. And so with that, I would like to close. If you're interested in becoming a Social Venture Partners, you can feel free to reach out to us at any time. And of course, if you're interested in sponsorship for these workshops or the Response series in 2021, please also reach out to us via our website. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.